Thank you, David, for this opportunity and a great honor. So myths, histories, and surgical heroes, that's what I'm going to talk about. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles and its devastation, which put pain thousandfold upon the Achaeans and hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades, strong souls of heroes, but gave their bodies to be the delicate feasting of dogs, of all birds. And the will of Zeus was accomplished since that time when first there stood in division of conflict Atreus' son, the Lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. So that was the first stanza in Homer's Iliad, an ancient Greek epic poem written in the 8th century BC. It depicts a tale passed from generation to generation for centuries by bards who could recite over 30,000 lines of poetry from memory. Homer, who you see depicted here as a blind bard, lived in the archaic period of classical antiquity. The historical backdrop of the Iliad poem is the time of the late Bronze Age collapse in the early 12th century BC. Homer separated from his subject matter by about 400 years, the period known as the Greek Dark Ages. One could say that the inspiration for writing down the words of a well-known song was to push the "Let's Make Greece Great Again" agenda. So the Iliad does not include the legend of the Trojan horse, nor the death of Achilles by an arrow to his heel. It tells of the battles and events during 10 weeks of the war in a quarrel between the leader of the Greeks, King Agamemnon, who you see dressed here in non-period garb, and on the right is Achilles. It tells of Achilles' grief when his friend Patroclus donned Achilles' armor and went into battle to try to turn the tide. Patroclus was killed as Achilles pouted on the sideline. And it tells the choice that Achilles made to return to the battle to find honor and forfeit a long and happy life at home in Greece. Now, Achilles had a problem that was common to many surgeons. He was half god and half man. His mother was a goddess, Thetis. And the problem he had is mom came to see him after Patroclus was killed with some armor that Vulcan had made and exhorted him to return to the battlefield. This was his choice. For my mother Thetis, the goddess of the silver feet, tells me I carry two sorts of destiny toward the day of my death. Either if I stay here and fight beside the city of the Trojans, my return home is gone, but my glory shall be everlasting. But if I return home to the beloved land of my fathers, the excellence of my glory is gone, but there will be a long life left for me, and my end in death will not come to me quickly. It's the same choice some of you medical students have to make. Do you want to go into surgery or not? Do you want a long, happy life or a life with glory? This is Achilles triumphant dragging the body of Hector around the walls of Troy, and what he gained in so doing was kleos. Kleos was gained, but life was lost. So what is kleos? Well, the ideals of the Greek heroic age that are depicted in the Iliad and the Odyssey are these: eidos, which is duty; iodos, supporting the arts; arete, striving for excellence; dike, striving for justice; ergon, having a strong work ethic; xenia, kindness to strangers; and kleos, the most important of them all, being praiseworthy. All traits important to a surgeon, I would say. Troy was an actual place. It's mythologic, but there was a historical Troy, and it dates to around 1200 BC. These are the walls of Troy, which you can see in Greece at this day. They were unearthed by a self-taught archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, who in the late 19th century started blasting away on the plains of Turkey. He actually blasted through the real Troy to get to an earlier city, and he found this treasury of gold, which he described as King Priam's treasury. It really wasn't King Priam's treasury, but he liked it so much that he married a young Greek bride and got her to wear his jewelry. That wasn't enough. He continued his explorations. The classical Bronze Age of Greece, the heroic age, had many palatial cities and cultures. And Schliemann took the boat across the Aegean, went down to Mycenae, and uncovered the ancient classical city of Mycenae with its famous lion gate. He found more Mycenaean gold and a death mask, which he described as the Mask of Agamemnon. Now, it wasn't really the Mask of Agamemnon, but it's a death mask from that period, and it emphasizes the point where myth and history converge in the Iliad. There was a mythical Troy and there was a historic Troy. Myth has a basis in history, just as surgical history is frequently mythic, but that myth too is based on factual events. And to discover the history behind the myths, you have to dig through many layers of history. Schliemann thought he had discovered the sacked city of Troy. Actually, that was several cities above the one he had excavated. Similarly, surgical history, the history of eponyms and firsts, lies buried in many cities over many years. These are my granddaughters, and when we visit them and put them to bed at night, we go through a various permutation and combination of my wife and I reading them stories. And they never fall asleep until one of them says, "Papa, will you tell us a story?" Which are the four most important words in the English language. You've seen Ray Charles, his picture out in the hallway, and we're here in Music City. And what's Music City like? They asked Ray Charles why he liked country western music. He says, "It's because I like the stories." So there's something inherent in the human brain that stories are attracted to. When I see students and residents in the clinic and I'm seeing a patient I haven't seen in 10 years, they say, "How do you remember what went on in the operating room?" I said, "Well, you know, the stapler didn't fire. And the patient spent 6 months in the ICU." Well, it's a story, and you remember that. So this is a figure that's larger than life, a friend of John Van Heerden's named Charles Poix, a famous endocrine surgeon. And his technique in scrubbing was to scrub bare-chested at the sink. And as he walked in the operating room, his man Maurice took the pipe out from his mouth and put the mask up, and he gowned bare-chested. After the operation room, he left the gown on and left his bloody gloves on. Maurice put the pipe back in his mouth, and he went and talked to the family. He felt that was more dramatic, and he understood better what they had. Well, I put this up here not just to tell you a good story, because John has actually written this down and published it, but just to emphasize that ritual that we used to go through at the scrub sink, where we spent 10 minutes scrubbing with students and residents, and we told stories. And this is what it sounded like. Who did the first appendectomy? Who did the first cholecystectomy? Who did the first gastrectomy? And if they didn't know any of the answers, we would say, "Well, who's buried in Grant's tomb?" And about half the students would get that right. And if they got that right, we said, "Well, who did the first Whipple?" And usually they could figure out and say Whipple. Well, surgical history, like Homeric history, is oral history. A lot of the tales that are most important don't get written down. They get passed on from surgeon to surgeon, generation to generation. And that's an important reason why you come to this meeting. That's why we have so many social events that are alcohol-fueled, so you can hear the real history of surgery. The word surgery derives from the word handiwork. And so I'm going to tell you about some surgical heroes, some famous surgeons who practiced when surgery was handiwork. This is in the pre-anesthesia age. These are 18th century surgeons, and these are three of my favorite eponomic surgeons: Percival Potts, John Hunter, and Ashley Cooper, who was actually a student of Hunter. And I like to talk about them because they are all associated with well-known surgical shrines. These are some of my favorite shrines: St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where Potts worked; Guy's Hospital, where Cooper worked; and of course the Hunterian Museum, where you can learn all about Hunter. In Charleston, we're very proud of our old history, but we don't have any hospitals that were founded in 1123. So Percival Pott, he is the king of the eponyms, no doubt about it. He was the first scientist to demonstrate that a cancer may be caused by an environmental carcinogen. That was Pott's cancer, which young chimney sweeps got from cleaning the chimneys of sooty London. There's a host of other eponyms that you can read. Best known for Pott's fracture, which was a fractured dislocation of the distal tibia and fibula. This is St. Bartholomew's in modern time, and you can see the King Henry VIII gate here still as it was seen in Pott's time. And what you don't see here on the right is there's a tavern. And it was in that tavern that Potts was exiting one day when he tripped and fell, and he got a Pott's fracture. So if you want to be famous, you name a disease after what you've got. So it was a fracture dislocation, and that time the treatment was amputation. Potts, being creative, innovative, and willful, got a few medical students, I'm sure they were, and said, take the door off the tavern and carry me to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, which they did, and he saved his leg. Now there's another entrance there. I showed you the Henry VIII gate, and this is another gate you can go into. It's a Tudor gate, but it takes you into a Norman chapel. This is the church of St. Bartholomew the Great, which sits adjacent to the hospital. And the reason it does is as you walk down the aisle, you see the tomb of Rahere. So Rahere was a priest and also a court jester. That was a good job back then, similar to the jobs you get in the Trump administration. And he was on a pilgrimage to Rome when he's caught in a bad storm, and he had a vision of St. Bartholomew, and he said, hey, look, Saint, if you get me through this storm, I'll build not only a hospital, but a church, and I'll name it after you. So that all happened, and if you exit the church and take a left and go into the Great Hall, the north wing, you'll see a staircase. And as you walk up the staircase, you see these grand paintings that were painted by Hogarth. Hogarth's father was in debtor's prison when he was born, and so he was taken care of at this hospital. And in gratitude, Hogarth painted these wonderful murals on the Great Hall of the Pool of Bethesda and the Good Samaritan. At the bottom of the Good Samaritan, there's some writing. And one of my favorite pet peeves are speakers who put up slides and say, I know this is a busy slide and you can't read it at the back of the room, and most people in the front of the room can't read it, but rules are made to be broken. So what it says on this slide is, this foundation stone was laid by Rahere, prior of the Order of St. Augustine, during the reign of Henry, in purification of the vow he made to St. Bartholomew. Go up the stairways, you take a left, you come to the Great Hall, which has a number of busts of portraits of famous British royalty. And as you walk down the hall, you came to the most important one, that of Henry VIII, who gave the royal charter in 1540 to the Company of Barbers and the Guild of Surgeons. That was the time when the surgeons gained some respectability, but still in honor of that time, they continued to refer to themselves as Mr. and not Doctor. So if you exit the Great Hall, take another left, you'll come and you'll have a chance to see the original Pott's disease specimen. And it's in one of these wonderful glass and steel pathology museums. There are Paget's disease specimens, all kinds of interesting things there. And as you walk around that second layer and take a left, you'll come to a small room. And in that room, there's a plaque. And what the plaque says is that this place, on New Year's Day, 1881, were spoken these deathless words, "Sir, I perceive you have been in Afghanistan," by Mr. Sherlock Holmes to Dr. John Watson. You see, Holmes was a chemist at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, a great example of why there'll always be a Great Britain. They're always making jokes behind our back. Actually, A. Conan Doyle based the character of Holmes, his deductive ability, on a surgeon. Sir Joseph Bell, a Scottish surgeon. So let's move on. Let's go to another hospital, to another surgeon, and talk about Astley Cooper, the most prominent surgeon of his day, who said that the surgeon should have not only the wisdom of Solomon, but the hands of a woman. So he was sergeant surgeon, and I think that's the great title. Rather than being chief of surgery at Guantanamo Bay, I wish I'd been sergeant surgeon there. By the way, I was chief of surgery because I was the only surgeon there, and it was the best damn department I ever worked in. So he was surgeon to some pretty big dudes there, and you can see the eras he worked over. He worked over the long hair era, the bouffant, and then made it into the photographic era. He is the prince of eponyms, I would think. And we all know every time we do a hernia where Cooper's ligament is going to be. Never where you think it's going to be. So he worked at Guy's Hospital, which was founded in 1721. Guy's was founded by Sir Thomas Guy, who was the father of insider trading. He owned a lot of South Sea stock. He sold it to his friends and relatives, knowing that it was worthless. And when it crashed, he had a lot of money. He had no progeny, so he gave the money to form a new hospital that was to treat incurable discharge from St. Thomas Hospital. This, I think, is the first really true academic medical center. And that, too, as you go up the portal, has another one of these glass and steel anatomy museums. And as you walk around this museum, you see a host of specimens, but then there are the portraits. And these are the great men of Guy's Hospital: Thomas Hodgkins, Richard Bright, Thomas Addison, and Sir Richard Gull. And the reason that they were able to advance medicine at that time is this is a time where physical diagnosis met pathology. They were able to dissect, and you could see someone who had signs and symptoms of Addison disease, and then you dissect them and you find they have TB of the adrenals. Now this Guy's Hospital, when Cooper worked, was before the Anatomy Act of 1832. And so also around this museum there are these wonderful wax sculptures. And they were created by a young man called Joseph Town, who when he was 17 came to London. Working from books without ever having seen a skeleton, he made this wonderful wax model. He knocked on Cooper's door. He brought this box, knocked on Cooper's door, and Cooper took one look at it and said, I've seen the wax skeleton, I approve. And he hired him. And so he had a job there for 1,400 years making these wax models, 14,000 wax models over half a century. Cooper was a student of John Hunter. And he's the one who said, nothing is known in our profession by guess. It is right, therefore, that those who are studying their profession should be aware that there is no short road to knowledge, and that observation on the diseased living, examination of the dead, and experiments upon living animals are the only source of true knowledge. Hunter is the founder of scientific surgery. After reading a letter that Jenner sent to him explaining his theories about cowpox and why milkmaids didn't get smallpox, Hunter just replied simply, well, why think, why not try the experiment? Great advice for a surgeon. Stop getting another CT scan, just operate. We know about Hunter's Canal. Every time a fempop clots off, we have to hear about it again at M&M. So I liked Hunter. He was a Scotsman, and so he grew up in the country. He was a wild youth, wasn't a great Greek or Latin student. Finally, his parents got tired of him and sent him to London to work with his brother William, who by then was a successful surgeon and had a very successful anatomy school. So Hunter went to work there, and he excelled at this. He was a great anatomist, great dissector. The skills he developed dissecting toads and newts and frogs in the field were well applied here. And he got so good at it that he became a successful surgeon, had a very profitable practice that he could really follow his true passion, which was to buy large mammals. And he kept them on the grounds at his home here at Earl's Court. He liked big mammals. He liked bones. And these are all preserved today in the Hunterian Museum. This is one of the biggest. It didn't roam his property, but it was an Indian elephant that was brought to London. It didn't survive the winter weather, despite the sweet wines that they gave it. They said when the rhinoceros was drunk, it would bleat sweetly like a cow. It's interesting that this is the animal in which the parathyroid gland was first discovered by Hunter and his colleagues. This is another beautiful specimen in here that's a picture that I was able to take in focus and was very proud of. And when Mark Ravitch gave a talk to the South Carolina Surgical on intussusception, I thought he should have a chance to have a copy of this slide, so I sent it to him. And about 2 weeks later, I got a nice note back from him saying, well, he thanked me very much, but he had enough slides of his own. And he sent me an article that he had written as a medical student on this very specimen. So the lesson is don't try to out-professor the professor. So when Hunter died, the government brought all his collection. They put it in the Royal College of Surgeons, where there's a museum. And the museum got bombed during World War II, but a lot of the specimens were left. And if you look back there on the right, is the Irish giant. And the Irish giant was a well-known man in his time. He stood close to 7 feet and knew that Hunter was interested in him, knew about Hunter's big bone interest. And Byrne made elaborate preparations to be buried at sea after he died. A bribe from Hunter to some of the undertakers acquired the skeleton very easily, and he took him to his home at Earl's Court and boiled them down into the boiler to the house. He was not an easy guy to be married to. So this is the Irish giant Byrne, who's still there. His skull was x-rayed at a later date, and he did have an enlarged sella, so he was a pituitary giant. Well, that's all fun and good history and stories, but let's get back to the topic at hand. Who actually did the first Whipple? So before doing a Whipple, a few things had to take place. As mentioned this morning by Dr. Feliciano, we needed anesthesia, and you see this reenactment of the first use of anesthesia at the Ether Dome in Boston. So by the mid-part of the century, anesthesia was there, and then there was the problem of bacteria. So Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister were very good friends, and Pasteur had looked under the microscope, and he had seen these clusters of grapes, and he says, I know those are the putrefactive elements in infection. He convinced Lister of this, and so Lister went back and paid attention to what Pasteur had said. Gentlemen, Pasteur said, microbes will have the last word in surgery. So this was Lister's solution. He filled up this atomizer with carbolic acid, took it to the operating room, and whenever he operated, they still didn't wash their hands, but you see the surgeon did roll up his sleeves. He sprayed this nasty substance in the operating room, and it Listerized not only the patient, but the surgeon, and it led to bad dermatitis, iritis. It was worse than a Da Vinci robot. And so people discarded it. They found a lot of reasons why it shouldn't be done because it wasn't easy to do. So the Germans had a better idea. And you see here Samuel Gross operating with surgeon sleeves. And if anybody has a coat that has buttonholes in it, those are called surgeon sleeves, so you can roll them up when you operate. And you were a good surgeon, the more blood you had on your coat. In fact, the best surgeon was the one who didn't need a coat hanger. His coat could just sit there stiff with blood. Well, the Germans figured out what to do with this, and they developed the technique of aseptic surgery. Instead of killing the bacteria in the operating room, let's just keep them out of the operating room. This is Charles McBurney at Roosevelt Hospital at a later date, and you can see how much the operating room changed in a 20-year period. I hate it when I get an article to review from Germany that describes the Whipple operation as a Kausch-Whipple operation. You see here the German surgeon Walter Kausch operating in an aseptic technique. And the history is that he really did the first Whipple, and just in deference to us, instead of calling it a Kausch operation, they call it a Kausch-Whipple. Well, in matter of fact, there are a number of people who did a pancreatic duodenectomy before Kausch. Earnhardt, Michaud, and then in 1898 was the date of the first true pancreatoduodenectomy. It was non-anatomic. And this was a guy named Codevilla who worked in Imola. Most of what he did was orthopedic surgery, because that's what you could do then with the least amount of complication. And he was an outstanding academic and clinical surgeon. He's the short guy in the hat outside his hospital in Imola, which when it closed, its records were transferred to the Rizzoli Institute at Bologna. So in the 1940s, not that long ago, an old colleague of Codevilla remembered Codevilla talking about his 1898 pancreatic head resection case. So he went into the library, and in an envelope containing clinical cards about gastric resection, he found the case in question. And if you can read Italian, what you could read on this card is that in February 8th, 1898, part of the head of the pancreas was resected with duodenum, the distal bile duct, and the distal stomach. The bile duct and duodenal stump were oversewn. A Roux-en-Y gastrojejunectomy and cholecystojejunectomy were done. Not bad. However, there was no pancreatic anastomosis or closure, and the operation was a success, but the patient died of cachexia 18 days later. Alan Oldfather Whipple is a proper surgical hero. His biography by John Howard describes him as missionary surgeon. He was the son of missionaries in Iran, grew up in Iran, went to Princeton, trained in medical school, in surgery in New York, and he became professor of surgery at Columbia University. In 1935, in the Annals of Surgeon, he published a case report of 2 patients and a review of the literature. He had operated on one of them, and his colleague Parsons had done the other. It was a 2-stage, and it was a non-anatomic pancreatic head resection. It was an ampulovator tumor, so they just carved out a bit of the pancreas. One patient died 8 months later from cholangitis, and the other was well 3 months post-op. These are the kind of papers I like to write. Alexander Brunswick was a famous Chicago surgeon. On February 11th, 1937, at the University of Chicago Hospital, he did the first true anatomic resection of the pancreas head, removing all pancreas to the right of the SMV. It was a 2-stage pylorus-preserving resection. The pancreatic duct, again, was ligated. This was published in SGNO in 1937. So then, in March of 1940, Whipple did the first 1-stage pancreatoduodenectomy. So the earlier operations were done prior to the discovery of vitamin K, and the only way you could operate on a patient without bleeding to death was to bypass the biliary tree first. So they would bypass the biliary tree and then go back 2 weeks later. By this time, they'd figured out how to fix the coagulopathy. And so on March 6, 1940, Whipple operated on a patient who he thought had a carcinoma of the antrum. He was a little confused. It turned out to be an islet cell cancer, but he divided the stomach before it became apparent that the origin of the tumor was the head of the pancreas. He proceeded with the first anatomic 1-stage pancreatoduodenectomy with antrectomy and complete removal of the duodenum and ligation of the pancreatic duct. The patient was alive and weighed 80 pounds 5 years later. In this publication, in the Annals in 1945, Whipple wrote this: "We regret that our subsequent reports on this subject are seldom referred to, and that our original paper describing a 2-stage procedure is always mentioned. Because of the newer advances in pre- and post-operative treatment, I condemn the two-stage procedure and advocate the one-stage procedure with choledochojejunostomy and implantation of the pancreatic duct into the jejunum as the procedure of choice. Again, a classical Whipple he describes, but he did not do on this patient, and he did not report a patient that he did a classical Whipple on. To me, the most important part of a Whipple operation is the pancreatic anastomosis. What is the Achilles heel of the operation? How was that problem settled? And I think the person who best described how to handle the pancreatic anastomosis was Richard Cattell at the Leahy Clinic. Cattell gained great fame as being the surgeon for Anthony Eden, Winston Churchill's foreign secretary, who had a biliary stricture and came to the Leahy Clinic to have it repaired in the 50s. In a lecture that Cattell gave at the Royal College of Surgeons in 1948, Cattell said this: "It remained for Whipple to bring Gordon Taylor's prediction to fruition, for in 1935, Whipple and his associates reported the first successful pancreatoduodenal resection, which was performed in 2 stages without anastomosis of the pancreatic duct. A few months later, in the same year, Hunt reported a similar operation with anastomosis of the duct of Wirsum." Actually, Hunt did not report a similar operation. Hunt's operation was another resection of the ampulovator with implantation of the duct, which was not uncommon. This is the Cattell technique that is still employed by many surgeons today. It's a 2-layered anastomosis with interrupted sutures done over a stent. It's a mucosa to mucosa, duct to jejunum anastomosis. This is the anastomosis of a classic Whipple operation described by Cattell. So what should we call this operation? A Codevilla, Brunswick, Whipple, Cattell operation? Well, I don't think we need to do that, because there is evolution and there is revolution in surgical progress. Things don't happen with a bolt of lightning out of the sky. They develop over the time, and many people are involved in developing new operations. We refer to Theodore Billroth as the first man to do a gastrectomy, but actually Jules Payon, a Frenchman, had done one months before he did. Unfortunately, Payon's patient died. Similar with the Bassini operation. Halsted and Bassini both discovered and developed an anatomic hernia repair at the same time. Halsted, not being prone to me-firsters, said, "It's fine, Bassini is a good guy. Let's just let him call the operation a Bassini operation." Evarts Graham gets credit for doing the first pneumonectomy. William Reinhoff, a Hopkins surgeon, had actually meticulously worked out sound surgical technique for pneumonectomy prior to Graham's. He developed a technique of separately dissecting out the artery, the vein, the bronchus, a really beautiful operation. Graham went to the operating room, took an umbilical tape, wrapped it around the hilum, and took out the lung. He got the credit. Similarly, Norman Shumway and Richard Lauer carefully worked out the technique of cardiac transplant at the lab in Stanford. Christian Barnard visited, went back to Cape Town, and did the first heart transplant, gained great fame not too late after. And it's not just confined to surgery, this evolutionary, revolutionary streak. Newton and Leibniz had a great quarrel about who developed calculus, who developed gravity, and it has led to some legendary rap battles in science. I'm sure you've all heard of the gangsta-style scientific rap. "There'll never be another friggin' genius like me. I invented optics, mechanics, and the theory of gravity," says Newton. "You peeked at my manuscripts. Don't try to lie. I'll drop apples on your calculus, steal an ass from the sky." To which Leibniz replies, "If you didn't publish first, then you can't be pissed with my superior notation. Fluxations won't be missed. I'm glad you'll be a virgin when you die at last, so your inferior genes won't be ever passed." Stephen Jay Gould is an evolutionary biologist, and he has a wonderful piece on the creation myths of Cooperstown, addressing this topic of creation myths, revolution, evolution. Now, we all know that Abner Doubleday was the creator of baseball. Doubleday was actually in Charleston at the beginning of the Civil War. He was in Fort Sumter. He escaped. He became a popular general and was credited with inventing baseball. And there's still this sign on a New York State highway: baseball was invented in 1839 by future American Civil War General Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown, New York. So who was the propagator of that story? Well, A.G. Spaulding was the commissioner of baseball at that time, and he also had a company that made baseball products. And he said that in the hearts of those who love baseball, Doubleday is remembered as the lad in the pasture where the game was invented. Only cynics would need to know more. Spence told us cynicism is a sign of burnout, and there's some cynicism about this. In the late 1700s, Jane Austen wrote a novel, and her main character, Catherine, was described as not very wonderful because she should prefer baseball at the age of 14 to books. So historically, there were many English stick and ball games of the 19th century. The upper classes played cricket, which could go on for days. Working class people played time-limited stick and ball games, which came to America with the early settlers. Baseball became codified in 1845 in New York City by this man, Alexander Cartwright, when he introduced foul lines, home plate, and a closed field that made American baseball a spectator sport. So you'd have to vote Cartwright over Doubleday. Gould asks, why do we prefer creation myths to evolutionary stories? For some reason, he says, we are powerfully drawn to the subject of beginnings. We yearn to know about origins, and we readily construct myths when we do not have data. Evolution, he says, is continual change, but not insensibly gradual transition. In any continuum, some points are always more interesting than others. So it is with the Whipple procedure. There are a number of interesting points. Codavilla, Whipple, Brunswick, Whipple again, and then Cattell. I find no harm in these creation myths in our surgical history. Heroes and shrines are inspiring, and there is substance in standing at the scrub sink and telling stories about Hunter and Pott and Cooper, and Whipple, just as there is grandeur in the sweep of continuity of surgical history, and then in the names of Codavilla and Brunswick and Cattell. What matters is that when we are in the operating theater, we continue to tell the stories of our surgical heroes, and we do this not as a form of ancestor worship, but as a gateway into the life of a person who can serve as a beacon of light into the future. We should continue to recognize in our surgical heroes the ideals that Homer depicted in the Iliad, the ideals of the Greek heroic age, which are also the ideals of the surgical profession. And those are duty, supporting the art and science of the profession as you are doing here, striving for excellence, striving for justice, having a strong work ethic, kindness to strangers, and kleos, doing things that are praiseworthy. So in conclusion, to answer the question, who actually did the first Whipple? Well, who's buried in Grant's tomb? Grant. And who did the first Whipple? Whipple. Thank you very much.